writer, soldier, politician, adventurer, conservationist, and president are just a few key terms that can be used to describe President Theodore Roosevelt. Today I'll be presenting why I think President Theodore Roosevelt was a great leader. Some of the topics discussed today will be his early life, 2 of the 16 behaviors identified by Zinger and Folkman, effective use of power, an example of his successful leadership, and some of his major accomplishments. Theodore Roosevelt was born October 27, 1858 in New York City, New York. His father, Theodore Sr., was a wealthy businessman known for his philanthropy and business exploits, and most notably known for establishing many of New York's renowned museums. Theodore Jr. suffered from several severe illnesses as a child, including asthma, gastrointestinal pain, and severe headaches. Much of his early childhood was spent indoors, where he developed his love for reading and writing. Determined to experience life and go outside and be a child, Theodore adopted an intensive exercise regime to strengthen his body, which allowed him to overcome the illnesses, and he began traveling extensively with his family, and that's where he developed his love for the outdoors and adventure. Zinger and Folkman identify 16 behaviors or competencies that make a difference in how a leader is perceived by others. One of the behaviors that stood out when I was researching Theodore Roosevelt was how he inspired and motivated others. When war was declared on Spain in 1898, Roosevelt resigned from his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and organized the first volunteer cavalry, which has commonly been known, or more famously known as the Rough Riders. During the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt inspired his men by leading the charge of the Rough Riders on foot, even though they were a cavalry unit, up Kettle Hill during the Battle of Santiago. His exploits made him an instant military hero throughout the United States. Roosevelt commented on this battle by saying, "On the day of the big fight, I had to ask my men to do a deed that European military riders consider utterly impossible of performance. That is, to attack over open ground and unshaken infantry armed with the best modern repeating rifles behind a formidable system of entrenchments. The only way to get them to do this in the way that it had to be done was to lead them myself." This statement by Roosevelt is very prolific because it shows the way that he leads others, not from the back, not by calling the shots, he leads from the front. And due to this, Roosevelt was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in 2001 for his actions at Kettle Hill, making him the only United States president ever awarded America's highest military honor. Another behavior identified by Zinger and Folkman was his personal capability, or his innovation. In September 14, 1901, he became the 26th president after the assassination of President McKinley. He was known as a reformer, and he brought numerous new ideas and programs never before heard of. One of his innovations, or one of his strong suits, or his platforms, was to enforce the already established Sherman Antitrust Act. By doing this, he brought approximately 45 antitrust suits to dissolve monopolies in the oil, coal, railroad, and the food industries. In 1903, he also signed a treaty with Panama, which began the construction of the Panama Canal, and this increased shipping channels and commerce, and it also shortened the distance of trade routes. He further established and promoted conservation movements by creating national forests, conservation areas, and the United States Forest Service. By the end of his presidency, he had conserved 230 million acres and set them aside for public land use. President Roosevelt also exhibited effectively several use of power. He did so in one instance by ending the Rousseau Russo-Japanese War. In 1905, he led negotiations between the Russian and Japanese empires who were at war over disputes in northern China and Korea. This meeting and negotiation and subsequent peace treaty signing has been called or known as the Portsmouth Conference, which led to the signing of the Portsmouth Treaty. During the negotiations and subsequent signing of the treaty, President Roosevelt used reverent power. He was obviously respected internationally as well as domestically. The Russians and the Japanese admired Roosevelt, which allowed for both parties to negotiate with Roosevelt as the mediator. He also used ecological power. He knew that by being the mediator, he was a key influencer of the treaty's compromises and the final outcome of the treaty. Roosevelt influenced the treaty in a way to protect and promote American interests in Asia and also bring about a peaceful end to the hostilities there. And in 1906, Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his successful negotiation and peaceful resolution of the Russo-Japanese War. Now, I'm going to touch on a successful leadership example other than the presidency, which most people know Teddy for. What most people don't know is that prior to becoming the Vice President of the United States, he was appointed as the New York Police Commissioner. And that was in 1895. And what he did was he brought about a massive police reform in New York. What he did was he implemented firearm inspections and physical exams. He appointed recruits based on merit and qualifications rather than political affiliations. He also did promotions much of the same way. He took a no-nonsense approach where he looked at qualifications rather than olden times where they used political affiliations with corrupt politicians to promote within. He further dismissed corrupt officers and supervisors, reshaping the entire department. He also oversaw the installation of telephones and police stations, and he regularly walked officer patrol beats to ensure that proper officer conduct was maintained and also that the officers were properly doing their job. All these reforms successfully contributed to higher officer morale, and it also fostered positive community and police relationships, although he did have a lot of major kickback from politicians who saw him as a barrier or someone who would get in their way of their profits. Now, there are major accomplishments that I can't name all in 8 to 10 minutes. So I'll just go over a few accomplishments that I found were pretty prolific and stuff that really stood out to me. President Roosevelt introduced the Square Deal, which was a political movement started by Roosevelt early in his first term. We know FDR's was the New Deal, but his predecessor was the Square Deal, made by his cousin Theodore. And it centered around the 3 C's. The 3 C's were conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. Now we know that Theodore Roosevelt was a major conservationist. And what he did was he led the conservation movement to protect natural resources. He set aside federal lands for national parks and nature preserves, and he established the U.S. Forest Service. And during the Square Deal, he created 5 national parks, 51 bird reserves, and 151 national forests. Secondly, the second C is control of corporations, and we know this by his use of the Sherman Antitrust Act, but he also regulated the railroad industry by passage of the Elkins Act of 1903, and he also passed another law called the Hepburn Act of 1906. He also brought suits against the Beef Trust to break up monopolies of the beef industry. The third C is consumer protection, which he did by the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. What this did was it banned improper labeling of food and drugs. It required active ingredients be labeled on all food, and that what this did was ensure purity of drugs and establish regulations for sanitary conditions for meat processing and production. So in conclusion, Theodore Roosevelt is a great leader because he overcame a debilitating illness as a child. He became a war hero known for his bravery. He inspired and motivated others. He was known as an innovator. He used reverent and ecological powers effectively. And he was a reformer and a conservationist who I feel was one of the greatest leaders of all time. I thank each of you for watching this and have a great day.